Michael Reynolds asked a question that silenced the room, a question no one else had ever dared to put into words, and the weight of it hung in the air like smoke. Asterisk. What do you do when someone smiles at you like you're fragile then? You learn they've survived a war you didn't even know existed. He didn't mean it for anyone to hear. Not really. But the words slipped out, trembling, heavy, and when he looked up, every pair of eyes avoided his, except hers. Elise! The quiet woman who scrubbed floors with a patience that felt older than time, didn't blink, didn't flinch, just set the mop aside like the question had been waiting for her all along. And that was the first moment, the first fracture in reality, where he realized he might not want the answer. You! Sitting here? Hearing this now, you don't understand how close you are to something people bury in classified files, in locked cabinets, in whispers that vanish as soon as they're spoken. It's not a story. Not a rumor. It's more like you've stumbled across a record you weren't supposed to read. The kind of record with redacted lines that make your skin prickle. The kind that makes you wonder what was cut out and why. You feel it already, don't you? That tightening in your chest, that thought you shouldn't be hearing this, but you can't stop. That's how Michael felt. Staring at her, knowing too much, had already shifted in those few seconds. Because the strangest part wasn't her silence. It wasn't the way she stood taller, straighter, as though the mop handle had been a rifle once, or the way her eyes darted toward the window like she was checking for threats no one else could see. The strangest part was what happened when he reached for the file, her file, the one someone left on the counter like an accident. Though deep down he knew accidents like that don't happen. He only meant to glance at the cover, to confirm the name, to satisfy that gnawing suspicion in his gut. But the second his hand touched the folder, Elise whispered something so soft only he heard it. And in that whisper, everything he thought he knew about her, about himself, about the room they stood in, cracked open like glass under pressure. She called him by a name he had never spoken aloud. A name buried in his own childhood. A name no living person should have known. And then before he could breathe, before he could ask, she was gone. Not walked out, not excused herself. Gone! Like the air had folded her in. And all that was left was the file he was never meant to open, his own reflection in the darkened window. And the sickening knowledge that her story wasn't about who she was, it was about why she found him. Would you like me to continue this directly into the next sequence where Michael opens that file and sees the truth written in plain ink, or would you prefer I stretch the suspense? Keeping the file unopened until something even stranger forces his hand. Michael's hand hovered over the file long after Elise had vanished. His fingers trembling in the stale office air, the paper cover sweating beneath his touch as if alive. The whisper still echoed inside him, not in his ears but in his bones, vibrating in places memory had no right to reach. The name, she spoke, his name that wasn't his, gnawed at him, pulling threads loose from the fabric of his life. He told himself, he imagined it, that grief, fatigue, or some buried corner of his mind had cracked open and bled hallucination. But the room betrayed him. The fluorescent lights overhead stuttered for a fraction of a second, a pulse of darkness. And when they stuttered again, he wasn't certain they had come back, the same shade of white. He opened the folder. The first page was Ordnance Standard military formatting. Typewritten lines that spoke of rank, station, commendations, and dates that had reached back farther than Elisa's face should allow. His pulse slowed, a false relief filling him, until he saw the photograph clipped to the corner. Elise. Not older, not younger. The same Elise. Unchanged. Her eyes fixed on the camera with that quiet, devastating stillness he remembered from just moments ago. The date below the photograph made his throat lock. 1974. Michael shut the folder so fast, the paper cut his palm, and the blood that welled there looked too bright, too raw against the beige desk. He pressed his hand to his chest and tried to breathe, but the silence pressed harder. That's when he noticed the sound, a faint static, like the soft hiss of a detuned radio, coming from the corner of the room. He followed it with his eyes, and there it was, small black recorder, its red light blinking. He didn't remember bringing it in. He didn't remember it being there. Yet it was, patiently spitting static like it had been recording him all along. He pressed play. The voice that came through wasn't Elise's. It was his own, layered over itself. Fragmented sentences bleeding into one another like someone had spliced the tape in haste. Asterisk, you saw her. No, You didn't. She's not here. Don't trust it! Don't trust yourself! His own voice warning him, contradicting itself, stuttering in places like entire words had been erased. He ripped the batteries out and hurled the device across the room. But the echo of his own warning wouldn't stop. Michael sat at the desk, his chest heaving, and for a long while, he wondered if anyone else had even noticed Elise existed. He thought back to the mornings. She cleaned the halls, the evenings she passed him by without looking, the small kindnesses no one else seemed to register. Had anyone ever spoken her name aloud? He tried to recall, but the memories warped as soon as he reached for them, like pages dissolving to ash in his hands. He could picture her, but not place her. He could hear her voice, but not recall the words. Even the whisper of the name she spoke slipped further away the more he clung to it, leaving only the sensation of being known too deeply. The knock at the door startled him. It was Thomas Grant, the building supervisor, a man whose presence always felt a little too rehearsed, like he was reading from a script someone else had written. His smile was wide, too wide, and his first words clung to Michael's nerves like hooks. You look pale. Did you find something you shouldn't have? Michael stiffened. What do you mean? Thomas tilted his head, the smile never breaking. Files go missing sometimes. People disappear. It's better not to go digging. Michael tried to laugh, to brush it off as a bad joke, but the sound that came out of his throat was thin, lifeless. He wanted to ask if Thomas had seen Elise, if her absence meant anything to him. But something in Thomas's eyes warned him not to. They weren't curious eyes. They were watching eyes. Measuring? Recording? Still, Michael couldn't help himself. Do you remember Elise? The woman who cleans here. For a fraction of a second too quick for certainty, Thomas's smile faltered, his pupils tightening like pin. Then the grin snapped back into place. No one by that name works here. You're tired, Michael. You've been under stress. Don't let your mind play tricks on you. It was the wrong answer, but it was delivered with a confidence of truth. Michael's stomach turned. He searched Thomas's face for a crack, a tremor of honesty or guilt, but all he found was smooth assurance, polished and empty. That night, Michael couldn't sleep. His phone buzzed on the nightstand at 2:17 a.m., a notification with no sender, no subject, only an audio attachment. Against reason, he pressed play. The recording was grainy, a hallway echo, footsteps trailing into the distance. Then came Elisa's voice, hushed, urgent, threading itself through the static. Asterisk, they will tell you, I don't exist. That's how you'll know it's me. Asterisk, the message ended, but the recording time kept running. 20 seconds of silence. 30, 40. And then, faint but unmistakable, the sound of his own voice, groaning broken, like a man begging for forgiveness. Asterisk. Stop reading. Stop remembering. It's not yours to carry. Asterisk. He dropped the phone, heart pounding, the screen glowing like an open wound on the dark floor. The next morning, Thomas greeted him in the lobby with the same bright smile, the same warm voice. Rough night? He asked casually, as though he knew. Michael forced a nod, swallowing the rising bile. He needed to leave, to breathe, to ground himself in something ordinary. But as he passed the reception desk, he noticed the folder again. Elisa's file, back where he swore he had left it, destroyed, shredded, scattered. Only this time, his name was typed across the cover. Not Michael Reynolds. Not the man he thought he was! The name Elise had whispered, the one buried in his childhood, stared back at him in black ink. And when he touched the folder again, the light stuttered not once, but 3 times, plunging the lobby into brief pockets of shadow. Each flicker seemed longer than the last, as though time itself had caught its breath. And in that stretched, suffocating silence, he realized the question wasn't who Elise really was. The question was what he had forgotten about himself. Would you like me to push the story deeper into Michael S. unraveling? His struggle between believing Elise was real and fearing she, as a projection of his own buried tremor. Would you prefer I bring Thomas's role forward as a manipulator? Who may be covering up the truth? Michael convinced himself the madness had a pattern. That if he could just gather the scattered pieces, the whisper, the file, the recordings, The way Thomas's smile cracked like porcelain under heat, he could stitch it together into something sane. He needed a thread to follow. Something clean. Something that would let him believe he hadn't already slipped too far into the void. The third morning after Elise's disappearance, he woke with the clarity of a man who thought he de-solved the riddle in his sleep. His body felt lighter, his steps steadier. He told himself the answer was in the file, not in Elise, not in Thomas, not in any of the shadows pressing at the edges of his vision. The file was the fixed point, the physical proof that none of this was just his mind crumbling. He spread the papers across his dining table, arranging them with the precision of an investigator instead of a man on the verge. Dates aligned. Commendations fit the timeline of wars he vaguely remembered reading about in history books. The photo, Elise, frozen in time. Stopped feeling like a ghost and more like an unsolved riddle, one he could solve if he tried hard enough. His heartbeat slowed as the story wrote itself in his head. Elise wasn't supernatural, she wasn't a phantom. She was a forgotten veteran. A classified experiment. Maybe someone who had been scrubbed from records but survived. The government had buried her existence and he had stumbled into the cracks. It was horrifying, yes, but also clean. A cover-up, a lie of history. That was a truth he could live with. For the first time since she vanished, he exhaled. He almost believed it was over. That he had found the hidden truth they didn't want him to remember. He rehearsed the words he'd use when he told someone, maybe an old friend, maybe a journalist, how the world erases people when they no longer fit the narrative. He even caught himself smiling, a bitter smile, but still, it felt human. Then he noticed the handwriting. One line, almost invisible, scrawled in the margin of the third page. Not typewritten like the rest, but a hurried, uneven hand. The ink slightly faded as though it had been written decades earlier. Asterisk, stop pretending you don't know me. The air thickened. The confidence drained out of him in an instant, leaving his skin prickling with cold. He touched the paper, and the words bled into him, not just the meaning, but the weight of memory pressing against the locked door in his mind. He staggered back, chest pounding, as if the words weren't addressed to Elise at all. They were addressed to him. A memory surfaced then, sudden and violent. He was a boy again, maybe 9 years old, standing in the hallway of his childhood home. The smell of smoke was heavy, the wallpaper peeling from heat, though he remembered no fire. His mother's voice, low, frantic, calling a name that wasn't his. That name, the one Elise had whispered. He remembered standing frozen, paralyzed, while she looked past him with terror in her eyes. Not at him, but through him, as if something else was there in the room, watching from just beyond the doorway. He had buried this memory so deep it came back in jagged fragments, but now it lined up perfectly with what had happened days ago. The whisper, the disappearance, the way reality folded in on itself. It had all happened before. He sat at the table with his hands gripping his knees, rocking slightly, whispering to himself that he wasn't crazy. Asterisk! You're not crazy! They lied to you! He repeated it like a mantra, like a prayer, but the words lost their comfort when he realized he didn't know who they were. His chest tightened as another piece clicked into place. What if Elise wasn't the anomaly? What if he was? That was when the television turned on by itself. The screen glowed in the corner of the room, static at first, then slowly sharpening into grainy black and white footage. It showed him, Michael Reynolds, sitting at the same table, in the same clothes he wore now, but his posture was different. He wasn't studying the papers. He was staring directly into the camera, eyes hollow, lips moving. The sound cut in, distorted, broken by audio glitches, but enough came through to freeze him where he sat. Asterisk! It's not about her! It's about what you agreed to forget. He stumbled toward the TV, panic choking him, but when he touched the screen, it went black. No menu, no channel number, no power. Just a dead reflection of his pale face, trembling in the glass. The false resolution dissolved. Whatever neat explanation he had built for himself. Elise, as a veteran, a hidden war, a classified cover-up collapsed under the weight of this revelation. He wasn't uncovering her mystery. He was unearthing his own. And someone or something had been watching from the very beginning, nudging him along, leaving breadcrumbs and pulling strings, making sure he reached this point where the line between memory and reality snapped. The doorbell rang. It was Thomas again, but not the polished supervisor this time. His shirt was wrinkled, his eyes bloodshot, his smile weaker but more dangerous for its fragility. He leaned in the doorway like a man half drunk on truth he couldn't control. "You found it, didn't you?" he whispered, his tone trembling, desperate. "Don't make the same mistake I did." Michael tried to push him, to demand clarity, but Thomas grabbed his arm, nails biting into his skin. "They don't want you to remember. Not because it will break you, because it will break them. And then, as if some unseen signal had been given, Thomas released him, stepped back, and with a smile that no longer reached his eyes, whispered the same forbidden name Elise had spoken. The exact same voice. Michael stumbled back, his mind tearing at the edges. And in that moment, he understood. This wasn't about Elise. This wasn't about Thomas. The danger was older, deeper, something that had been circling his life since childhood, using faces, voices, and records like masks. Every memory glitch, every contradiction, every mystery uncovered wasn't proof of Magnisit, was proof of interference. The lights above them flickered again, not 3 times, but 4. Each blackout lasted longer, the darkness thick enough to feel, and in that suffocating pause between flickers, Michael heard something breathing in the room with them. Not Elise, not Thomas. Something else? When the lights steadied again, Thomas was gone. The file on the table had rearranged itself. The photo paper clipped to the corner wasn't Elise anymore. It was him! Micah, same eyes, same expression, same stillness, but the date below the photograph was decades before he was born. The story wasn't just about Elise vanishing. It wasn't about a cover-up or a lie of history. It was about him. About how long he had been missing without knowing it. And if that's true, then everything you've watched up to this point has been out of order. You'll need to go back. You'll need to see what you missed. Would you like me to take the next chapter into Michael? Trying to test reality-checking old records? Visiting people from his past, only to find his existence itself. Docent line up, or should we tilt further into the psychological breakdown, where even the audience begins to question if Michael ever existed at all? Michael didn't sleep the night after Thomas vanished. He sat at the table with the file in front of him, the photo of his own face staring back like a stranger's reflection. And every attempt to shut his eyes only dragged him deeper into flashes of memory that didn't feel like his. He saw himself walking streets he didn't recognize, signing documents with a hand that trembled as though resisting, hearing voices call him by that buried name he never admitted aloud. He told himself it was exhaustion, that the brain invents when it can't reconcile, but each time he whispered it, the words lost weight, like lies rehearsed too many times. Then, just before dawn, his phone lit up again. No number! No caller ID! Just a message! And the words froze him. Asterisk, you were right all along. He opened it, expecting another audio file, another glitch in his sanity, but instead it was a photograph. Grainy, discolored, time-stamped 2003. The frame was shaky, like a still pulled from a VHS tape or handheld camcorder, but he could make out the faces. A group of people gathered in a dimly lit room, eyes fixed on the camera, each holding up a single page. On every page was the same symbol, 2 intersecting circles with a vertical line cutting through the middle, like an eye that had been blinded but could still see. And at the center of the image, sitting among them, with that same haunting stillness, was Elise. Michael's hands shook so hard he almost dropped the phone. It was proof. Not of madness, not of hallucination. She existed. She had been documented. But the timestamp carved into the corner mocked him to he would have been 12 years old, barely old enough to understand what war even was. Yet the faces around her were watching him, waiting for him, as though he had always been part of this circle. Hours later, he found himself walking through town without realizing why, his body moving on instinct, drawn by something older than memory. He passed walls, covered in graffiti, cracks in the concrete, faded posters. And the same symbol kept surfacing the intersecting circles. The vertical line, spray-painted in alleys, carved into wood, etched in rust on a lamppost. Once seen, it couldn't be unseen. He stopped counting after 30. The whole city was breathing it, hiding it in plain sight. And for the first time, he realized it wasn't just him. Others had been here. Others had marked the path. That night, the dreams started. They weren't ordinary dreams, not fragmented nonsense. These were precise, shared, communal, stitched into his sleep like broadcasts meant for him and others who carried the same infection. In one dream, he sat in a basement lined with old television sets, each screen glowing with footage he didn't recognize. Parades, riots, funerals, ordinary street spot, always at the edge of the frame. Someone watching. Sometimes it was Elise. Sometimes it was Thomas. Sometimes it was his own face, blurred but unmistakable. And in the silence of that room, he wasn't alone. He felt the weight of other dreamers breathing beside him, unseen, connected, silently watching what he watched. When he woke, his phone buzzed again. Another message. This time, it was text, no image. Asterix, the footage they never released is already inside you. Trust what you see. Michael felt the world tilt under him. Whoever sent these messages wasn't exposing him to something new. They were reminding him of something already embedded, buried beneath layers of denial and erasure. Every memory glitch, every contradiction wasn't madness. It was residue of interference. And now he began to wonder if Elise wasn't a ghost but a guide, if Thomas wasn't an enemy but another lost piece. By the end of the week, Michael couldn't distinguish between waking life and the network of communication that threaded through him. The messages stopped being confined to his phone. He found slips of paper tucked in his jacket pockets that he hadn't placed there. Receipts from stores he hadn't entered carried handwritten words. Asterix, stop pretending. It's time to come back. And sometimes, just as he was drifting between wakefulness and sleep, he heard a chorus of voices whispering through the vents, through the static of the radio, through the gaps in his memory. They weren't threatening. They weren't kind either. They were waiting. The third perspective came without warning, like an intrusion rather than an arrival. Michael was in the library, desperate to anchor himself to something ordinary, flipping through microfilm archives, when the voice spoke from behind him. A woman's voice, calm, almost conversational. You've been reading the wrong records. He turned, and there she was, not Elise, not someone familiar, but a woman with dark hair streaked silver, her eyes heavy with the look of someone who had carried secrets too long. She slid a folder onto the table. No name, no label. Just the symbol again? You think you've been losing your mind? She said, her voice so soft it was almost drowned by the hum of the microfilm machine. But the truth is worse. You've been losing your life in pieces. They've been erasing you and giving you back scraps! And you're not the only one. Michael wanted to demand who she was. Why she was helping him? What any of this meant but. The words locked in his throat when she leaned closer and whispered, I'm not here to stay. I'm here to remind you, there's still a choice. He blinked, and she was gone. No footsteps! No door opening! No trace she had ever been there. But the folder remained. Inside were clippings, photographs, yellowed documents. Asterisk. Found footage from 20 years ago. A reel of tape pulled from the wreckage of a government facility fire, unreleased to the public, never acknowledged officially. In one still image burned into the report, he saw them again, the circle of people holding signs, their faces blurred by flame damage, but their eyes intact, staring through decades. One face, though scorched, was unmistakable. His own. The dread that followed wasn't just fear of manipulation. It was recognition! This wasn't the first time he had uncovered the truth. This was a cycle, a loop, a rehearsal that had been played out before and scrubbed clean until he began again. Blind and willing. He felt the audience of dreamers pressing closer, not strangers anymore but witnesses, each of them reliving the same unraveling, each of them feeding off one another's doubt, paranoia, and grief. The messages grew sharper. They weren't about Elise, or Thomas, or even him as he knew himself. They were about identity itself, about how fragile the idea of self was when someone or something had the power to take it apart, rearrange it, feed it back in pieces. He found himself staring into mirrors longer, waiting for a face he recognized, but no longer trusted. His reflection lagged once, a fraction of a second slower than his own movement, and that was the moment he stopped believing in coincidence altogether. There was a force beneath all of it, not named, not visible, but present. A watcher, the one leaving marks, whispering through vents, bending time in flickers of light. Michael could feel it tightening around him like a net, not to destroy but to contain, as though his awakening was dangerous, not to him but to asterisk them. The heavy truth settled in his chest. The world around him wasn't stable. It wasn't linear. It was curated. And every step he took toward remembering put cracks in walls they had built to hold him. The last message arrived without a device. No phone, no paper, no whisper. Just carved into the condensation of his bathroom mirror after a shower. 3 words. Asterisk, you're not alone! Michael wiped the glass, heart racing. But the letters didn't vanish. They deepened, etched into the surface, as if the mirror itself had been waiting to deliver the line. And in that moment he knew there were others, not just Elias, not just Thomas, not just the woman in the library, but an entire unseen audience. Dreamers, witnesses, people who had been watching his story unfold as though it were theirs too. And if you're still here, still listening, still tracing the symbols and replaying the moments, then maybe you're one of them. The ending didn't close. It pulsed, heavy and unfinished. A signal left open for whoever was still awake enough to recognize it. Because once you've seen the pattern, once you've caught the glitch, you can't unsee it. And maybe, just maybe, that means this story isn't his anymore. It's yours. Would you like me to now tilt the next chapter toward Michael attempting direct contact with these others, where viewers themselves become part of the communication or escalate further into the perspective of the hidden force itself, revealing fragments of its intent without ever giving it a name? Michael had always told himself that truth was something solid, something you could hold in your hands like a stone, sharp-edged but steady, grounding you in a world that otherwise shifted too quickly. But sitting there now, surrounded by the papers, the symbols, the messages carved into mirrors and the whispers threaded through his own memories, he realized truth was not a stone. It was water! It slipped through his fingers each time he thought he held it, taking on the shape of whatever vessel he poured it into. Elise! Thomas! The woman in the library! The strangers in the grainy footage, they weren't answers. They were reflections of the same current. And for the first time in his life, Michael asked himself, not what happened, but why. The answer that came wasn't logical. It wasn't even entirely his own. It rose from somewhere beneath thought, beneath reason, from the raw place where trauma and faith intertwine. Asterisk, because you wouldn't survive knowing who you are all at once. That was the truth he had been circling since childhood. Since his mother called him by a name he wasn't supposed to carry. Since the first memory glitch he buried with the help of whatever force had been erasing him piece by piece. He had been protected not from an enemy, but from himself. And now the protection was gone. His phone buzzed once more. A final message. No sender, no ID, just words that cut him open. Asterisk, it's time to decide. Do you want to remember, or do you want to live? Michael stared at the screen until his vision blurred with tears he had not let himself shed in years. He thought about the faces in the footage, the people holding the symbols like lanterns in the dark, waiting for him. He thought about Elise, her silence heavy with knowledge, her whisper tearing through him like a scalpel. He thought about Thomas, warning him not to repeat his mistake. And most of all, he thought about himself, the boy in the hallway, the man at the desk, the reflection in the mirror that lagged half a second behind. Like even his own body wasn't sure if it belonged to him. He whispered into the empty room, his voice breaking. I don't know who I am without forgetting. It was a confession, raw and unbearable, because it was true. Every version of his life he had believed in was built on erasures, on gaps, smoothed over by something unseen. If he chose to remember, he would burn all of it, down his childhood, his name, his sense of time itself. He would be stripped bare, rebuilt as someone he had never been allowed to know. And if he chose to live, he would remain in this curated world, haunted by glimpses, trapped in cycles, never truly whole. The silence in the room pressed back against him like a presence waiting for his answer. His reflection in the darkened window stared back. Not passive, but watchful, like it already knew which path he would take. He reached for the file one last time, fingers trembling, and when he opened it, he didn't see records or photographs. He saw a mirror, clear and perfect, reflecting only his face, but this time, it moved first. His reflection leaned forward before he did, lips parting to speak. "You wanted the truth?" it whispered. "Now you'll learn why you were never meant to hold it." Michael's chest ached, not from fear, but from recognition. This was the moment. Every message, every glitch, every forbidden symbol had been leading him toward not a solution, not an answer, but a choice of belief. If he believed the reflection, he would shatter. If he denied it, he would remain in chains. Both paths meant death of a kind, and yet both promised something resembling freedom. And so he closed his eyes, let the weight of everything press down on him, and chose not an answer but a surrender. He let himself break open, not resisting the flood of memory that came crashing through. He saw faces, hundreds of them, strangers and family alike, each one tied to him by threads of erased history. He saw the watchers, the ones who had shaped his life like clay, bending him into the version that would not collapse beneath the unbearable weight of remembering. And at the center of it all, he saw himself not Michael Reynolds, not the man the world had told him he was, but the name whispered in the dark, the name his mother had called, the name Elise had returned to him. It felt like dying. It felt like waking up. When he opened his eyes, the room looked the same. The table, the file, the window, but he knew it wasn't. It was heavier, fuller, threaded with truths too large for language. He felt them pulsing in the walls, etched into the air, humming in his bones. He wasn't safe. Not anymore. He wasn't even entirely himself. But for the first time, he was whole enough to know he had been broken. And that's what it revealed about being human. That sometimes we survive, not by knowing, but by forgetting. That memory is both wound and medicine, depending on how much you can bear. That the line between truth and illusion isn't drawn by the world, but by what we choose to believe. He stood, trembling, knowing the watchers were still there, still listening, still guiding. But the decision was his, now. And whatever came next, he couldn't unknow what had been given back to him. The lights flickered one final time, plunging the room into darkness for longer than comfort allowed. And in that silence, the reflection spoke again, not cruel, not kind, just inevitable. "You were right all along." And then, nothing but his own ragged breath, and the weight of a story that had only just begun. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for stories you were never meant to hear. Until next time, remember, some truths don't want to be found.